Welcome to Module 7 of Ombudsman Associate Certification Training. In this module, we're going to talk all about complaint handling. This module is just about 49 minutes long. This module is going to introduce you to the Ombudsman complaint handling process and the important role of volunteers in identifying and helping to resolve complaints. By the end of this module, you'll be able to help Ombudsman specialists with complaint handling, complete high-quality complaint intake, and be able to identify abuse so that you can then inform us immediately when you see it. For Section 1, we're going to go over just an overview of complaint handling. So what is a complaint? A complaint is a problem presented to or identified by the Ombudsman that can't be resolved with a quick fix. Complaints require that a case be opened and that an investigation be conducted. Complaints often require discussions with multiple parties, such as other residents, to determine the scope of the complaint, staff, family members, and others. They might include any concern that affects more than one resident or area. Complaints include any problem that happens time after time. Requests to staff are sometimes just quick fixes. They can be resolved by making a simple request and are not issues that are reoccurring or widespread. They don't involve care or right issues. A few examples of quick fixes include a light bulb that might be burned out in a resident's bathroom. You can make a request to have maintenance resolve it right then and there, and you're able to see it resolved or trust that it will be fixed promptly. Another example is if a resident's remote control has dead batteries. You can make a request to have the batteries replaced while you're there. Medical issues, call light problems, wanting to leave the facility, and abuse should always be reported as complaints. In another module, we'll talk about how to report requests and complaints differently. So is it a request or is it a complaint? Not every concern brought to our staff or volunteers will be opened as a case that needs investigation. Many residents will share that they are dissatisfied with something about their current situation. This can be something as simple as a refill on their water or a desire to just go down to the dining room. Remember that you won't help the resident in getting those things, but you will ask staff to help them. Other concerns are more complex and need to be investigated before the resident can be satisfied. So in the next slide, we're going to do an exercise regarding requests or complaints. Sometimes it can be difficult to figure out if something can be handled through a simple request to staff or if it is a complaint. So let's go over some examples on the next slide. So requests or complaints. So number 1, a resident's daughter is taking the resident's money and not paying the bill. Is this a request or a complaint? This one for number 1 would be a complaint, and it would require us to open a case and investigate. Number 2, the resident wants another blanket. Is this a simple request, or do we need to open a case regarding this complaint? This is just a request. The resident just wants another blanket. We could also ask the resident if she's often cold or if staff usually help her with blankets, but this is just a quick fix. Number 3, an aide called a resident a derogatory name. Is this a simple request or is this a complaint that we need to open a case for? This would be a case regarding staff attitudes. Number 4, the resident wants to go home. Is this a simple request or a case? This would be a case. We need to investigate and get more information on why the resident wants to go home and what steps we could take to help them meet their goal. Number 5, several residents are in jerry chairs. Is this a request or a complaint? This one is neither, kind of a trick question. We need some more information. Do they want to be in their chairs? We need to find out what information is needed. Do we see residents lined up in the hall just for staff convenience? Are residents able to get up out of their chairs? Are they comfortable? How long are they in chairs? So we need to make some observations before making a case for this one. Number 6, a resident's sheets need to be changed. Is this just a simple request or a complaint that needs a case opened? This is just a request. We can ask the staff that the resident wants their sheets changed. Just as kind of a simple fix. We could ask the resident if this is a common occurrence. If it is a common occurrence, then we can open a case. So number 7, an STNA says the director of nursing is mean to her. Is this a request or a complaint? This one is possibly neither. The staff, the STNA, is not our client, but we need to figure out if the director of nursing has a bad attitude toward the residents too. Is her attitude impacting how the STNA cares for residents? So this would be neither. We would just kind of do some more investigation. Number 8, residents are tired of being served chicken. Is this a simple request or a case? This would be a case. It sounds like it's frequent and throughout the facility, and dietary is unlikely to change the menu with a simple request. We need to do a case on this for this complaint. Number 9, a resident did not get a shower today. Is this a simple request or a complaint? This one could be either. Is this common? If we went to go ask staff to give this resident a shower, did they attend to it right away with our simple request? If not, then we would open a case. And finally, number 10, a resident did not get her medications on time. Is this a simple request or a complaint that needs a case opened? This would be a case. Depending on the medication that the resident did not get on time, this could put her in pain or cause a threat to her health. So we would open a case for this one. Moving on to this slide, this table is from data pulled from federal fiscal year 2022 from our Otis system on the most frequent complaints for nursing homes from October 1st to September 30th for the federal fiscal year. So we do report this data and a lot of other information to our federal partners at the Administration for Community Living. It helps us to tell the story of what's happening here in Ohio, and other states also report this too to show what's happening across the nation. So these are our top 10 complaints for this federal fiscal year, but the top 10 complaints vary somewhat each year. Not much has changed related to the top complaint each year, and that is the discharge or eviction complaint. This is the #1 complaint every year, going back for decades. Visitors did pop up on this table in the federal fiscal year 2020, primarily due to COVID. It's not often in the top 10 of the lists, but for part of that federal fiscal year of the pandemic, visitors actually overtook the discharge complaint as the top complaint. And as you can see, just these 10 complaint types represented just over 53% of all the complaints that we investigated as a whole. And then likewise, this table shows the most frequent complaints against assisted living facilities, aka RCFs, in federal fiscal year 2022. So just like in nursing homes, discharge complaints also fell in the top spot. You also might hear more about billing issues in assisted livings as more residents might be involved in paying for their own care privately rather than paying through Medicaid. like you would typically see in nursing homes. And you'll see, on here that's the fourth complaint, the most common complaint here. And visitation was also an issue in RCFs in federal fiscal year 2020 due to COVID. Finally, as a comparison, these are the most frequent complaints against residential facilities class 2, which are the smaller adult mental health group homes. You can see that there's not nearly as many complaints, just almost 132 just on this chart in the total for the whole state in federal fiscal year 2022. So these complaints are more than 60% of the total complaints here. And part of the reason is that there's not nearly as many complaints in RF2s is that there are fewer residents overall. And we aren't as visible in the RF2s, as we are in nursing homes. In Region 9, we do a great job maintaining visibility, but across the state, that is something that the state is working on, is expanding presence in RF2s. And you can see discharge is the top complaint here. And then the smaller homes, housekeeping, pests, building structures, they often get more attention as they're typically in older, regular houses, and they might not have that much upkeep. So we're going to return to the basics of complaint handling. So when we receive a complaint, just like the ones that we discussed a couple slides ago, we need to investigate and open a case. So the Ombudsman program follows certain steps to investigate complaints. This is called the Complaint Handling Protocol and is outlined in detail in our Ombudsman rules. We'll dive into each of these steps in complaint handling next, like intake, investigation, resolution, follow-up, and documentation. Volunteers do have a critical role in each of these steps, but your involvement might vary based on the circumstances. So the art of intake. Intake is the first step in the complaint handling process. For volunteers, intake is likely to be done in person. And during intake, you'll identify yourself so the resident understands who you are and what your role is. Be supportive and listen actively. Arrange, to be cordial and supportive to get the whole story, the who, what, when, where, whys, and hows, and to help the client know what happens next. Be careful not to take positions or sides too quickly, and encourage the client to talk by using open-ended questions. For example, you could say, "Tell me about your meals," instead of, "Is the food good here?" You want to write down the critical facts, such as dates, addresses, or key ideas. Don't take notes in a way that distracts the client, and always ask the client if it's okay to take notes so you can jog your memory later. That's another good way to build trust with them. You want to obtain a solid complaint statement and a measurable goal, and discuss options for handling this complaint. We'll talk more about this and practice how to write complaint statements in just a few slides. You also want to avoid giving personal advice on the client's life. You must not give advice which is outside of the Ombudsman's scope or role, regardless of personal or professional background. And involve the client in the process of the case as much as possible and let them know what will take place next. Tell the resident what the next steps are. Set another time to meet the client. If you don't know next steps, that's okay. Just let them know that you'll be following up with them. So as we discussed earlier in modules 4 and 5, getting consent is a cornerstone of our work as Ombudsman. You have to obtain consent to reveal the identity of complainants and residents and others participating in an investigation. So for example, if a resident's daughter tells you about an issue, she is your complainant. We need her consent to share her identity with anyone. We also always need the resident's consent to share his or her identity. Only if a resident does not have capacity can we act on consent of a legal representative or a resident sponsor, like an engaged family member. Never assume consent just because a resident is telling you about something they want to have changed. Ask for permission and get a signature before proceeding to reveal their identity. There are occasionally times when we can't get a signature, and that's okay. Maybe the resident can't write due to a disability. In that case, if the resident gives you verbal consent, be deliberate about making a note in front of them and say, "That's okay. I'll just make a note for our records that you gave me permission to talk with the social worker to ask her to meet with you about the problem with your glasses." A complainant can be anonymous, like a caller into the office. Or when you're doing intake in person, they might want their name to be kept confidential. That's their choice and that's okay. Sometimes we can begin an investigation up to a point without identifying them. For example, if a resident's eye doctor appointment is canceled and needs to be rescheduled, we can inquire with the staff about how outside medical appointments are scheduled and how rescheduling is handled, and report that back to the resident. But we can't make sure that specific appointment is rescheduled without using their name. However, with many complaints, other residents are likely to be affected, such as interruptions in showering due to insufficient staff. In these cases, we talk to several residents to get enough information to be able to talk to staff about the problem, and everyone benefits, not only the first resident who told you about it. When investigating complaints, it might be necessary to look at resident records. We can only do that with written consent from the resident to reveal their identity. You'll only do that if asked by a staff ombudsman, and then they'll give you technical assistance. So if the resident does not give you consent to reveal their identity or act on their behalf, you still have a complaint, but we need to find another way to investigate and resolve it. You can ask other residents what they're experiencing in relation to the issue. So for example, you could ask other residents if they too are experiencing issues with getting their medications late or not having their linens changed often enough. If they don't, then you aren't able to verify the complaint or take any action that might identify the original resident. Also, ombudsmen can be complainants if multiple residents confirm an issue but do not wish to be identified, or if we observe an issue. During intake, you'll have to clearly identify what the problem is. The first step in this is to consider the resident's understanding of our role and whether they can clearly verbalize the problem or what they want changed. Do you need to talk to someone else, like a family member? Especially if the resident has many complaints or is having trouble explaining things, you'll need to help them prioritize those complaints. Share back with the resident what you think you heard as a summary. This can help to clarify the issue and make sure that you got it right. Finally, write out the problem in a few words. For example, if a resident is not receiving their evening medications on time, or snacks aren't being offered after dinner, that will help the investigation move forward without a lot of extra detail that isn't necessary. You want to hear that detail, of course, but it's helpful to the investigating ombudsman to know the problem first. While meeting with the resident, you'll have an opportunity to give them some empowerment tools that might help residents act on their own to address issues. We want residents and families to feel empowered to resolve problems on their own. Some may not feel comfortable with this, and that's okay. They don't have to take on the problem alone. Assure them that the ombudsman can take charge if that's the route they choose. There are some examples here. We provide information about requirements to give them confidence to talk to staff, give them tips for staff are usually helpful, and so on. The staff ombudsman is going to help you with this as you get started, so don't feel like you need to be an expert. We want to be sure that goals we're working toward with the resident are reasonable goals. What does the resident want? Is it reasonable? How long is it going to take? Is this something that the ombudsman program actually has authority to help with? For example, sometimes the residents want us to fire certain staff. That's not something we can do. So in the next couple slides, we're going to work on crafting some good complaint and goal statements. Remember, complaint statements should be a summary of the specific problem that the client is facing. Goal statements should be reasonable and achievable. They go together like gears. Without a good idea of the complaint, it's hard to come up with a solid goal to achieve. Likewise, you could always write a lovely goal, but it might not solve the problem. Here's example 1. The complaint is, the resident needs activities appropriate for her, and the goal is to find some activities that will interest the resident. So is this a good complaint statement? Is the goal measurable or achievable? What questions could we ask to determine what activities are appropriate? This complaint is not specific enough. What activities would be appropriate for her? And what does appropriate mean to this resident? So the goal is unclear, what will interest her. So we could ask some clarifying questions of like, what did the resident like to do for fun before they came to the facility? Do they have any hobbies? What sports? What TV shows? What books? What games do they enjoy? What do they do for a living? So this slide shows a better, improved complaint statement and a goal statement. So notice the difference here. The complaint statement in this example is much more clearer. It describes the gap between what the resident likes and what they're being offered, and the goal is measurable and achievable. So an ombudsman can visit next week and ask if the resident has fashion magazines available to her and whether her television has been tuned to entertainment-focused TV shows. So you'll have a self-study assignment for writing complaint and goal statements, which we'll go over at the end of this module. So another example here of an initial complaint and goal statement. So the complaint is the resident doesn't belong in a nursing home, and the goal is the resident wants to go home. So we want to figure out, why does the resident feel like they don't belong in a nursing home? What are some appropriate questions to ask? Why did the resident move here? How long have they been here? Is anyone helping them work on a discharge plan? Do they have somewhere safe to go? So we need to find a better complaint statement. So examples of that might be, resident wants to return home since she has completed her post-stroke rehab, but she needs grab bars and a ramp for safety, and no one has helped her obtain those. And the goal is for the resident to obtain those so that she can go home. So section 2, we're going to talk about investigation. So now that we have consent, we're ready to begin investigating. We need to begin investigations as soon as possible, keeping in mind that the problem might have been going on for a while before we learn about it, and it's probably affecting the resident's daily quality of life. Probable harm, like an injury or an illness or abuse, is more urgent, and investigations must begin by the end of the next business day. During investigation, we want to gather the facts. When the problem happened, how often it occurs, who's involved, and where it occurs. If we skip the investigation process and assume what the solution should be, we might work toward solutions that don't actually fix the problem. As ombudsman, we need to look for the root cause of the problem and try to resolve that to prevent it from happening again. We want to talk to other residents to determine the extent of the problem. Maybe the problem just happens for one resident, or everybody in the unit, or the entire facility. We need to know this to help decide the approach to our resolution. So when we receive a complaint here in Region 9, if it is probable harm, like abuse or neglect, we need to investigate by the end of the next business day. If it is just a traditional complaint that does not involve abuse or neglect, we begin our investigation within 5 days of receiving the complaint. So we always attempt to determine the facts of the complaints as part of the complaint investigation process. We're not trying to reach a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt or even determine if someone is at fault. We simply just want to see from the resident's perspective whether their complaint is likely to be true. So there are times when the facts presented in the complaint cannot be verified. However, that doesn't mean we just stop any complaint investigation activities. Often there are steps that you can take to ensure your clients and complainants feel that they have been listened to and are satisfied with the resolution. You might not know whether you should call the problem verified, and that's okay. You can work with the staff ombudsman and we can help you decide. So we already talked about the importance of talking to multiple residents. So we're going to back up and talk about the different sources of information. There are many different sources of information to help verify the complaint and begin our investigation. So what sources of information you access will depend on the nature of complaints. So we're going to go through some of them, starting with interviews. During an interview, you're speaking with other residents, family members, staff, or other relevant parties with information about the complaint. An interview is simply a conversation with a purpose. Successful interviews have a clear goal. The interviewer decides who to interview to get certain key pieces of information. Are you asking about an incident and need dates, times, and a description of the event? Or are you looking for a pattern of activities like long call light wait times? Determine who has the information you need before you start interviewing everyone. Make sure that you can interview in a comfortable, private, and quiet space. Minimize noise and distraction. For instance, ask if you can turn down a television set if the person would like to join you in another room. It's important to first introduce yourself and build rapport with the person you're interviewing. Explain confidentiality and consent. You should use open-ended questions to get the resident talking. Practice good active listening. Try to control the flow of the conversation so you're working towards your goal, and take relevant notes about what the person is sharing that is useful to your investigation. Interviewing gives you a good opportunity to educate about the role of the ombudsman and resident rights. So we'll use that technique. Regarding investigation, we can also use documents. The Ohio Revised Code gives ombudsman access to records required to complete investigation. We can review resident records with their consent or provider records. So provider records include things like survey reports, admission agreements, transfer notices, personal needs allowances, and incident reports. We only review relevant documents as it pertains to the case we're working on. If someone has a complaint about cold food, we don't need to review a medical record or an admission agreement to resolve this problem. So generally speaking, resident records are off limits unless an ombudsman specialist determines that a review of a record is necessary and the resident provides written consent. Be very careful with resident and provider rights to protect residents' personal information. You can give that to the staff ombudsman to be documented in Otis. Each home is required to have a list of the residents currently occupying the building. We do have access to that record, but we shouldn't request it unless it's needed. But there are some situations where you might need it. One example is if you're there to see a particular resident but can't find them without a room number. You could ask to glance at the census list to confirm the resident is indeed there and find a room number. It would be preferable to ask for a census rather than asking staff to point you out to that resident, which would violate their confidentiality, especially if you don't have consent yet. Or we might ask you to obtain the resident census list so we can make calls to residents' rooms without identifying ourselves. So personal observations. When observing conditions where care is provided or where a resident lives, it's important to use all of our senses. So we want to approach a situation requiring investigative observation with an open mind and an understanding of what's observed. We want to be as impartial as possible. If we look only for evidence that fits a preconceived notion or theory, other evidence might be missed, or much of the evidence might be misinterpreted. We want to prepare for observing by deciding what type of observations will help us investigate a particular case. For example, in a complaint about a resident being given a regular meal instead of a salt-free dinner, we would be able to investigate by seeing that the food is served. By making an unannounced visit to the facility, we could observe a routine mealtime procedure. Familiarity with applicable rules will allow us to better judge which observations are relevant to the individual case. We want to record our observations during our visits or as soon as possible afterwards to eliminate errors due to memory bias. For example, recording what you expected to find instead of the actual facts of the observation. So in all of our investigative techniques, the goal is to find the root cause of the problem. One investigative technique is to use the 5 whys technique. Whenever an issue or a problem occurs, ask, why did the problem occur, at least 5 times. Here's an example. I want the home to use a chair alarm with my mom. Why? Because she has had falls. Why? Because she has had weakness in her legs. Why? Because she isn't participating in physical therapy to strengthen her legs. Why? Because she isn't an early riser and they schedule her sessions at 8 in the morning. Why? Because that is how it was initially written into her care plan when she moved into the home. Moving on to section 3, we're going to talk about resolution. So now we're ready to work toward resolution of our issue. You'll likely need to talk with Ombudsman staff to do so, and make sure you talk to the appropriate staff. For example, if the complaint is food related, we want to talk to the dietary manager. If it's medically related, we want to talk to the director of nursing or another nurse. If it's activities related, we want to talk to the activities director. If it's a general concern, we want to talk to the social worker. If the concern is about a manager or certain staff, then we want to speak to the administrator. We want to explain the problem and goal to staff as well as the results of our investigation. Hold them accountable for coming up with a resolution that attacks the root cause of the problem. Be careful not to ask questions about residents' medical issues if it isn't directly related to the case. And always involve or report back to the resident, just to kind of keep them updated in where things are and when they might expect activity toward their complaint. So there are common methods that ombudsmen use to seek resolution of a complaint. So the first one is education or empowerment. Informing the facility about a problem and suggesting ways to resolve this problem or helping residents act on their own. You'll have a strong role in educating residents and helping them speak up for themselves. We do this through individual advocacy with the residents that we meet. We also do this on a bigger scale when we encourage and support resident and family councils. For negotiation, this is used frequently and it assumes unequal power between the residents and the facility, for instance. There is a power imbalance, especially when a resident is dependent on the provider for basic care and their quality of life. For mediation, this is really only used between resident and resident or staff and staff when the power is balanced. Examples of this might be resident disagreements about the television volume or roommates that have concerns about the room temperature. So brokering, this is sending complaints to other agencies such as ODH, but staying involved. Sometimes we make referrals to the health department, Medicaid, and the Attorney General's office, and we stay involved to work with the group so that each agency fulfills their unique role. Systems advocacy is always done with the state ombudsman, who makes determinations about the positions of the state office. So regarding legal and administrative remedies, this includes assisting with discharge hearings, Medicaid hearings, Medicare hearings, or referring to legal services. We don't recommend private attorneys. If someone wants an attorney, we refer them to the local bar association's lawyer referral service. This is very important, even if you have a favorite lawyer or have a personal experience with an attorney. And finally, the last bullet point on this slide is systems advocacy. This involves legislative or policy change to address a problem. There are likely opportunities for you to get involved with systems advocacy. As ombudsman, we can comment on legislation, write to legislators, and participate in discussions with policymakers like state government agencies. Stay tuned, because when the state ombudsman is working on different policy changes, they might ask for outreach assistance. And follow-up activity. So ombudsmen should always follow up with residents after a complaint has been resolved. Check in with the client and other residents to make sure that the fix has stuck. Remember, quick fixes can become complicated if a problem persists or spreads. Also, you may be asked to conduct follow-up on a case assigned by an ombudsman specialist. The timing of the follow-up should be related to the type of the problem and the resolution, so the staff ombudsman will let you know what's needed. When we're following up on cases, we'll be working to determine the resident's satisfaction with the outcome. We also want to visit with others who may have expressed a concern but didn't give consent for our help. We want to make observations. Is the fix still in place? We want to report back what you've learned to the Ombudsman program staff within the time frame requested. And follow-up has to be timely, but make sure you've given enough time for the resolution to work. We can't close cases and complaints without ensuring that the residents are satisfied, so contribution to the follow-up process is helpful as a whole. So in Module 9, we're going to review more detail about reporting both advocacy activity and complaint activity. For now, just remember that the regional program will need key details from the client or complainant to begin complaint handling activity. Helpful details include those listed here: the client and complainant name and contact information, provider name and client's room number, consent, whether that's written or verbal, a precise statement of the problem and the goal, and actions taken previously by the resident, or actions taken by you after intake to verify, investigate, and inform staff of the complaint. The intent is that the staff ombudsman won't have to repeat any of the intake steps that you've already done. If you can provide details like the complainant's availability during the day or evenings, whether the client has a personal phone number, the staff ombudsman can be more efficient in responding. So these are some methods of reporting your visits. Email is typically the fastest method. We'll go over this more in Region 9, but if mailing or faxing works better for you, we can make that happen. And always by phone for abuse cases and care issues that involve harm. Call us right away. So here are some important points to remember. You should always inform the resident what your next action might be, and it should be resident focused. We want to involve the resident in every step of the process as much as possible so they're not left in the dark. Never reveal a resident's name without their consent. Never take action on an abuse complaint without talking with the staff ombudsman or volunteer coordinator first. Section 4, we're going to talk about abuse, neglect, misappropriation, and exploitation. So as you can imagine, the individuals at the highest risk for abuse, as described on this slide, are the same people that we encounter in long-term care facilities. In general, the following characteristics do place these individuals at a higher risk of abuse. That includes females who are older, people who need physical assistance, people who have compromised cognitive function, people who are low income, and have financial dependency. Though we often discuss abuse generally, there are different kinds of abuse that may be inflicted by perpetrators, including physical abuse, which is the willful infliction of injury, unreasonable confinement, intimidation, or punishment with resulting physical harm, pain, or mental anguish. It's important to note that physical harm doesn't have to happen to be considered abuse. Sexual abuse is forced and/or unwanted sexual interaction, which are touching and non-touching acts of any kind. Sexual abuse can include forced observation of sexual acts, taking sexually explicit photographs, or audio or video recordings. Unfortunately, these videos sometimes end up on social media, which adds another layer of distress. Psychological abuse is the infliction of anguish, pain, or distress through verbal or nonverbal acts. This includes but is not limited to verbal assaults, insults, threats, intimidation, humiliation, or harassment. And this can be conduct which causes or has the potential to cause the resident to experience humiliation, intimidation, fear, shame, agitation, or degradation. Other abusive activities are financial exploitation and gross neglect. So financial exploitation is the illegal or improper use of an individual's funds, property, or assets for another person's profit or disadvantage. Gross neglect is the failure to protect a resident from harm or the failure to meet needs for essential medical care, nutrition, hydration, hygiene, clothing, basic activities of daily living, or shelter, which results in a serious risk of compromised health and safety relative to age, health status, and cultural norms. You might also hear about instances of misappropriation, that is theft, or using someone's personal belongings for their own personal use. Another thing to consider is that abuse can now include posting videos on social media, sending text messages of resident photos without permission, and so on. For people living in facilities, there are many possible abusers. Caregivers, staff, and volunteers might be abusive or neglectful. In some cases, staff with abuse histories apply for jobs and are hired at facilities. In other cases, the abuse and neglect are a result of poor training and scheduling of staff who might be working short-staffed on a regular basis and are unable to keep up with the care needs. Other residents who were abusive when they lived in the community or who are now living with a chronic health or mental condition that inhibits their ability to control their own behavior may end up harming other residents. In some cases, family members and spouses or partners who were abusive when the older person was living in the community continue to be abusive at the home. In cases of long-term domestic violence, some spouses continue to physically and/or sexually assault the victim at the facility. Other family members may continue to financially exploit an older adult, even if they're living in a long-term care setting. Finally, on occasion, some strangers have even entered facilities to attack, rob, and/or sexually abuse residents. So when you talk to a complainant or a client, be aware that abuse can present in the different forms we just discussed. Residents may show physical signs of abuse like bruising, scratches, or pain. They may also show personality changes, fearful affect, or hesitancy to talk to an advocate. Residents might complain that they don't have access to information about their money or they can't pay their bills. Some discharge notices are given to residents because their families aren't using the residents' resources to pay for their stay. How others respond to a potential victim can be important. If a provider doesn't respond to reported abuse or responds badly, that resident may be even more negatively impacted. So different types of abuse will prompt different questions to ask, like are you safe now? Who hurt you? Or who stole from you? When did this happen? And have you told anyone before? Based on the type of abuse allegation, certain questions will be helpful to ask. What you want to know by the time intake is finished is who is the alleged abuser? Is the current resident at risk? Are other residents at risk? Does this person have access to other residents or further goods from residents? Start the regional program as soon as possible anytime you receive a complaint. It's even more important that you do so immediately if you become aware of a situation that might be abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Regarding probable harm, the Ombudsman Program must respond to probable physical harm by the end of the next working day. If you're not sure if the abuse rises to probable harm, report anyway. It's better to be safe than sorry. Some examples of probable harm include if a resident was dropped and bruised, if there are pressure sores, and if the resident is in pain. Ombudsman rules state that the program shall analyze the urgency of complaint based on information received during intake. Urgency can be residents facing another night in fear of a caregiver who is verbally abusive, a resident going without their blood pressure medications, a resident left on a toilet without someone to help them get back to their bed. Although we consider all complaints very important, we'd certainly rush out to investigate faster for one of these issues rather than a billing question or someone complaining of boring activities. So it's very unlikely, but if you happen to personally witness abuse, be sure to get yourself to safety first and then find a staff person to stop the incident. In cases of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, we must still seek client consent to reveal their identity and take steps on their behalf. If we don't know the client's name or they're not able to give consent, we consider them an unbefriended resident, and a regional program staff can open a case with the Ombudsman as the complainant. In these cases, the state ombudsman is involved to give consent on the resident's behalf. You might be aware that certain individuals are considered mandatory reporters. They're required to report suspected abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Teachers, healthcare personnel, social workers, financial service providers often fall into this category. However, as a representative of the Office of the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman, you do not fit into this category of mandated reporters. By federal law, states are not allowed to include us in mandated reporting requirements. This is because ombudsmen are prohibited from disclosure of identity of a complainant or resident without their consent. We serve as the agent for residents and help residents to achieve what they believe is in their best interest. Even if an ombudsman carries a professional license and is considered a mandatory reporter, because of this, the ombudsman must adhere to federal disclosure requirements when acting as an ombudsman and cannot be required to report abuse without appropriate consent. If you are a nurse, social worker, attorney, or have another type of license, when you are providing ombudsman service, you are not acting on that license. You shouldn't display those credentials on business cards, signatures, or in other ways when serving as an ombudsman. Now to wrap up this module, you'll have a chance to work on complaint and goal statements. That concludes this module. Thanks for watching.